Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Amber Nightingale Soltani, the Associate State Director for Community Outreach with AARP here in Northern Virginia. And I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. AARP Virginia is thrilled to continue our collaboration with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. This collaboration allows us an opportunity to bring our members a sampling of the rich programs that is offered each semester by Ollie Mason. From our earliest beginnings, AARP has been a champion of lifelong learning. Our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews, once said, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge, has no age restriction." Those words are as true today as when she spoke them in the 1950s. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in new ways throughout your life may strengthen your brain. Our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interests. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. And I hope today's lecture will do that for you and more. Thank you again for joining us.
Greetings and warm welcome from Ollie Mason. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University has been in existence for over 30 years. We offer lectures, clubs, special events, and trips, as well as many volunteer opportunities such as teaching and service on committees. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. We're very happy to be collaborating today with AARP, and I want to welcome all of our OLLI members, as well as those of you who are coming in from Virginia and across the United States. We're very happy that you've joined us today, and we hope that you will look at our website to learn more about OLLI at olli.gmu.edu. Please enjoy today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Mike. Welcome to OLLI members and AARP members. I'm looking forward to sharing with you all that I've learned about a very famous American, Frederick Douglass. He, in fact, is often considered to be the most famous Black man in the world in the 19th century. To start with a brief overview, we're going to cover three phases of Douglass's remarkable life. First, his period of enslavement. That's about the first 20 years of his life. He spent much of that in rural Maryland, where he experienced the beatings and other cruelties of slavery at its worst. But his stays in Maryland were fortunately punctuated by stays in the more benign setting of Baltimore, where he was able to teach himself to read and study great works of literature. He escaped from slavery and became a leading spokesman on the abolitionist circuit before the Civil War. He gave thousands of well-attended lectures, wrote 3 best-selling versions of his autobiography, and edited an abolitionist newspaper. For more than 30 years, in fact, he was able to support a very large family solely by reading and writing. His meeting with President Lincoln in 1863 was the first time a United States president met with an individual Black leader. The final stage we're going to cover is in the post-Civil War period. He continued his advocacy for emancipation, and which evolved into equal rights for the freed slaves, but he moderated his radical emancipationism somewhat, and for this he came under some criticism. He became active in the Republican Party and served in several high-level government positions. So let's begin with his life as a enslaved person in rural Maryland. He was born in Talbot County, Maryland. That's on the Eastern Shore for those of living in the Washington area. Interestingly, his birthplace was not that far from that of Harriet Tubman's. This is a picture of the house of his enslaver, Aaron Anthony. He was in rural Maryland. He was treated quite cruelly. This is his summary of the treatment at a young age. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. He was born in his grandmother's cabin, and he lived there in his early years. At that time, his name was Frederick Bailey. He rarely saw his mother, who lived about 12 miles away near the plantation where she worked. When his mother was dying at an early age, Frederick was not allowed to see her in her final hours, and his comment on this was, the heartless and ghastly form of slavery rises between mother and child, even at the bed of her death. And he expressed lifelong regrets at separations from his mother. It has been a lifelong standing grief to me that I knew so little of my mother and that I was so early separated from her. I take few steps in life without feeling her presence, but the image is mute and I have no striking words of hers treasured up. Douglass suspected that his father, he knew he had a white father pretty well. He suspected it was his owner, Aaron Anthony, and his description of Anthony was a brittle, unhappy man of haggard aspect, muttering to himself as he stormed about, cursing and gesticulating at his invisible foes. When Frederick was 6 years old, he witnessed Anthony's brutality firsthand when he brutally beat Frederick's 15-year-old Aunt Hester. Frederick believed that the motive for the beating was that Anthony was sexually interested in Hester and resented that she had formed a loving relationship with another young enslaved person. This picture is from a children's book and is pretty sanitized because she would have been stripped to the waist at the time of the beating. When Frederick was 6 years old, he was moved to the plantation where his enslaver was an overseer. And his biography, David Blight, incidentally, I'm going to be quoting a lot from David Blight, and he is a very eloquent writer and goes into tremendous detail on Douglass's life. This was a plantation. Blight believed that Frederick was aware of at least 7 whippings and murders, and there was a cruel overseer there, Austin Gore, and Gore's attitude was that it was unthinkable that a slave should ever contradict him. And according to Frederick in his autobiography, Gore believed, it is better that a dozen slaves suffer under the lash without fault than that the master or overseer should seem to have been wrong in the presence of the slave. Another witness involved the owner of the plantation, Edmund Lloyd, who later became governor of Maryland. Lloyd into horses, and an elderly enslaved person who was his groom was Barney. Lloyd didn't like the way one of his horses was looking when he came out for his ride, so he personally gave Barney 30 lashes. Now, when Frederick was 8 years old, he was sent to Baltimore to live with relatives of his enslaver and to be a companion to their son. This was a very different environment than rural Maryland. Baltimore had the largest city of free blacks in the United States at that time, about 10,000 out of 62,000 total population. And there was socialization between white boys and the free blacks. It was during this period that Frederick began the education, which led him ultimately to becoming such a eloquent spokesman for his causes. The wife of his owner, Sophia Auld, started teaching Frederick to read. She got so far as to teach him the alphabet and some small words, and she also read to him some. But when Sophia's husband, Hugh, found out about this, he forbade any further instruction. It was against the law in Maryland to teach slaves to read. And Frederick, in his autobiography, recounted that Hugh had said that if Frederick read the Bible, there'll be no keeping him, and it would forever unfit him for the duties of a slave. Frederick later said that Hugh's attitude inspired him to continued learning. Quote from Frederick, the very determination he expressed to keep me in ignorance not only rendered me the more resolute in seeking intelligence, I am not sure that I do not know quite as much to the opposition of my master as to the kindly assistance of my amiable mistress. He educated himself by reading newspapers and other books. He got some reading materials and help from his white friends. He sometimes traded bread for reading lessons. And a very important of his education was he got a hold of a copy of a volume known as the Columbia Orator. This is a collection of essays, including the works of Cato, Cicero, Socrates, John Milton, and Benjamin Franklin. The emphasis of the essays was on freedom, liberty. The book also contained guidance as to how to be an effective orator. And Frederick, in his later life, credited this volume as having been a great influence on his thoughts and his eloquence as a writer and orator. Interestingly, this volume was also a source of great inspiration to another self-taught great American, Abraham Lincoln. When Frederick was 9 years old, there was a crisis. The owner's slaves had to be divided up among the heirs. Frederick was sent back to Maryland for the decision on the division. Some of his relatives were sold to the deep plantations in the deep South and were never heard from again till after the Civil War. Frederick, unfortunately, was allowed to stay in Baltimore and go back to Sophia and New Orleans. He spent the next 6 years in Baltimore, where he formed friendships with Black clergy and laypersons. He developed an interest in the teachings and language of the Bible. Then another crisis occurred when he was 15 years old as a result of a dispute in the family of his enslavers. He was sent back to rural Maryland to work for Thomas Auld, who was actually his owner. And there was a lot of disagreement between them, and there were beatings of Frederick by Auld, and Frederick refused to work. And then he was sent to spend a year on a farm of Covey, who was Edward Covey, who was made a living off farming and also of disciplining difficult slaves to the breaking point where they would continue to work again. Frederick recounts that he was severely beaten by Covey. And as Frederick says, I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The distinguished to read depart. Behold a man transformed into a brute. And then a remarkable event occurred Frederick fought back as Lovey was beating him, and he ended up with his hands around Covey's throat, and drawing blood. And Covey gave up the fight, and Frederick regarded this as a big turning point in his life. To quote him, "I was nothing before. I am a man now. It was a resurrection from the dark and pestiferous tomb of slavery to the heaven of comparative freedom." Frederick's violence against Covey could very well have led to his arrest and hanging, but in fact, Covey let him continue to work on the farm and never laid a hand upon him again. Frederick speculated later that Covey feared that if word of that Frederick had fought back and beaten him got out, Covey would be ruined with his reputation as a slave breaker. From David Blight, the biographer of Frederick Douglass, who is a very eloquent writer, rivaling Douglass. Here's how David Blight describes the fight with Covey. "Frederick left a good deal of blood on that arch villain's farm, while also extracting a story he would one day make almost as immortal as Herman Melville's whaling ship. Douglass's great gift, and the reason we know of him today, is that he found ways to convert the scars Covey left on his body into words that might change the world. His travail under Covey's yoke became Douglass's crucifixion and resurrection." And as we'll see, the story of his relationship with Covey became a big part of his autobiography and his subsequent speeches in support of abolition. After the Covey beating, Frederick and a group of other young people tried to escape. They were jailed. They expected to be sent back to the Deep South. While they were in jail, the slave traders were hanging around, looking over the slaves they were going to be selling and tormenting them. But for reasons Frederick could never explain, he was not sold, and he was returned to Baltimore to work in the shipyards. His education continued in Baltimore. He began participating in religious and social organizations of the free blacks. He met his future wife, who was a free black woman, Anna Murray. He had a falling out with his master over the master rescinding an arrangement where Frederick could keep some of the wages he earned working in the shipyards. Frederick refused to work. The master threatened to beat him and sell him. Frederick decided that this was the time to get out of there, and he escaped to New York, a very dangerous venture to take part in. Part of it was he rode on trains, and Anna got him some papers which identified him as a free black who was working as a seaman. Of course, they didn't have photo ID in those days, but the papers included a description of what the holder of the papers looked like, and it didn't resemble Douglass very much. So had the conductor on the train examined the papers more closely, Douglass would never have escaped. But he did, and made his way to New York City. He was taken into shelter there by a black abolitionist, David Ruggles. At this point, he changed his name for security purposes to Frederick Douglass. The name Douglass came from a Walter Scott novel, The Lady of the Lake, which Frederick had been reading. Frederick and Ruggles decided that New York was too much of a dangerous. So he went to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was a relatively safe place for a fugitive slave. They had a lot. also a lot of Quakers who generally were opposed to slavery. Frederick worked as a manual laborer, joined a church. In the late 1830s, he began participating in local meetings of abolitionist groups in the area. His main focus in his talks was opposing colonization, which was a proposal of abolitionists to send blacks to countries in the Caribbean or Africa. In 1841, a white abolitionist invited Douglas to join a delegation of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, which was having a convention in the Isle of Nantucket. Douglas was invited to speak there, and the speech he gave was so memorable that it called him to the attention of the leading abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, who was very impressed. There's no record of exactly what he said in the speech, but Garrison's recollections were, "I shall never forget his first speech at the convention, the extraordinary emotion that he excited in my own mind, the powerful impression it created. I think I have never hated slavery." Garrison also described Frederick as one in intellect, not richly endowed, in natural eloquence, a prodigy, in soul manifestly created, but a little lower than the angels. Douglas's recollection of the speech is that it was mainly about his experience as an enslaved person, which we discussed earlier in this class. As David Blight described it, a star was born in 3 days in Nantucket. The Garrisonians enlisted Frederick to go on a 3-month tour of the abolitionist speaking circuit, and this began his career as a lecturer. In the beginning, what his sponsors wanted him was to talk about his bad experience as a slave and not get into talking about remedies to get abolition, but Frederick, of course, didn't go over his experiences very well, but he also began specific advocacy for ending slavery. And this was the start of a long career where he gave thousands of lectures in the United States of Europe, and first for abolition, and then after the Civil War for equal rights for the enslaved. His lectures were widely attended, and during the 19th century, he and Mark Twain were often regarded as the most successful Americans on the lecture circuit. In addition, he not only lectured, but he wrote, including his autobiographies and newspapers. Some general observations on the reason he was such a success as a lecturer. First, he had the ability to talk of personal experiences. As Douglas himself said, when he was comparing himself to white abolitionist speakers, "They cannot refer you to a back covered with scars as I can, for I have felt these wounds." This, incidentally, is not a picture of Douglas. It's a picture of another African-American and the wounds he suffered being a slave. I don't think there are any pictures of Douglas's wounds. Secondly, he was a very charismatic person. Here's a description of by a resident of Lynn, Massachusetts, David Johnson, after attending a lecture by Douglas. "Douglas was more than 6 feet in height, and his majestic form, straight as an arrow, muscular yet lithe and graceful. His voice rivaled Daniel Webster's in its richness, and in the depth and seriousness of his cadence, made up such an ideal of an orator as eyes would flash with defiance and now grow dim with emotions he could not control. And the roll of his splendid voice would pass to the minor key whose notes trembled on his tongue." And of course, there was the eloquence of his speeches, which I've already quoted some of his writings, and later on I'll quote some from his speeches so you can see just how well constructed and inspiring they were. I should note that his work on the abolitionist lecture circuit was very, very dangerous. They required travel on railroads, and there were often disputes on the railroads over segregated seating and just over people who didn't like the abolitionists. The abolitionists were very controversial and disliked in the North. They never even went to the South, but even in the North, they ran into a lot of trouble. Some descriptions of that from David Blight. On a tour of Indiana, Douglas and his associate met mobs nearly everywhere. Rotten eggs and stones and drunken hooligans were as usual in abundance. In Pendleton, Indiana, in Douglas's words, he was clubbed prostrate on the ground under a torrent of blows. My right hand broken and in a state of unconsciousness. My hand never recovered its natural strength and dexterity. Another danger Douglas faced was that he was a fugitive slave, and at any point he could have been captured and sent back to his owners in rural Maryland. He also wrote two best-selling autobiographies. 1845 was his first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It was widely sold. It sold 5,000 copies in the first 6 months and 30,000 copies by the Civil War. He also went to England, Ireland, and Scotland, where he gave lectures in support of his book and developed a lot of followers there. And some of his followers took up a collection to purchase his freedom from slavery, which they did. And at that point, he felt safe in returning to the United States. He also established his own weekly newspaper, the North Star, which had more than 4,000 subscribers and focused on abolition issues. And this enabled Douglas to comment on the issues of today, much like a blog or a podcast would do. Now, in discussing Douglas's work as an abolitionist between the late 1840s and the end of the Civil War, I want to back off a minute and give you some general background of the context in which he was operating. First, what was the abolition movement and what were they advocating? And secondly, what was the political situation at the time? So to begin with, abolition groups began developing after the American Revolution. They were not for an immediate end to slavery. They were for a gradual approach to ending slavery, in which there'd be a delay in when the slaves would be freed. In some proposals, only slaves born after a certain date would be freed, and they'd have to work some years as a slave before they would be freed. And so it would be a long-term process. And generally it was accompanied by the idea that there would be compensation to the owners for what was considered the property they were giving up. Another policy frequently urged by the abolitionists was colonizations, in which the emancipated slaves would be sent to colonies in foreign countries. Some early leaders in societies urging gradual abolition were John Jay and Alexander Hamilton in New York, Benjamin Franklin was president of the Abolition Society in Pennsylvania. He had a mixed record on this because earlier in his life he had owned slaves, and in his newspapers he had published ads for the selling of slaves, but towards the end of his life he became an abolitionist. So these were the early gradual abolitionists. In the 1830s, a more radical movement developed. This was frequently referred to as the first American social movement. It flowed out of a religious revival, the Second Great Awakening. A leader in this was William Lloyd Garrison, and his organization was the American Anti-Slavery Society, and they abandoned gradualism and adopted an approach of immediatism, meaning slaves would be freed immediately, and there would be no colonization. As the Garrisonian movement went forward, there developed some splits and offshoots. Garrison's approach was what was to ending slavery was what was called moral suasion. That means he wouldn't try to get laws or political action. He would try and persuade the owners of slaves that they were sinners and acting immorally, and that to get in right with their future, they better free their slaves right away. And it was hoped that they could persuade a large number of slave owners to free their slaves. Garrison's view was that you could never accomplish abolition through political action, legal action, because first of all, under the Constitution, it was doubtful that Congress had any power to end slavery in states where it already existed. And secondly, he just regarded the whole Constitution as process as hopelessly corrupt and tied to slavery. There was a split in the movement between Garrisonians who favored moral suasion and another group led by Arthur and Lewis Tappan, who are pictured here, who favored political action in which you would work through the political process to, if not end slavery, at least limit its expansion. And they wanted to tone down the fiery rhetoric of the moral suasion group. Since Douglass began his career as under the sponsorship of Garrison, he was first an all-out Garrisonian, but as we'll see later, as the Civil War drew near, he began supporting political action on some occasions. So now let's talk about the political issues in which Douglass was involved. Before 1850, slavery was not an issue in national politics. There were slave states and free states, and any action that would take place was mostly adding to the number of free states with action within the states, but there weren't many that were added. And the national political parties, the Whigs and the Republicans, had members from both the North and South, and they didn't take any particular positions on slavery. But as the 1850s began, we started getting new issues involving slavery, which was what was going to happen to the vast area of the country west of the Mississippi, which was largely unsettled at that time, but settlers were going to start moving in. And this includes the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which were part of the Louisiana Purchase. It includes lands acquired from Mexico by law and treaty, and also lands acquired from Britain. And what was going to happen with slavery in these areas. And whereas only a small part of the country had been previously concerned about slavery, they either lived in a slave state or a non-slave state, and status quo was pretty much observed. Abolitionists weren't that big a factor. But suddenly we got much more interest by people who weren't necessarily against slavery where it existed, but didn't want to see the rest of the country taken over by slavery. So the settling of this vast area in the West opened up the question of what kind of a country were we going to have? Was it going to be basically a country of free persons, or a country working under an economy and culture of slaves? And the North and the South had, of course, very different views on this. The South believes that a slave society was the highest form of civilization. They believe that blacks were inferior. They were only suited for menial work, and that it was best for them to do that, and that the country would make the most progress if we had the menial jobs carried out by blacks, and the whites having the freedom to pursue the culture and the arts. And of course, the blacks, slavery was a lifetime forever status, so the blacks would never advance out of slavery, and whites would be spared the degrading work and free to better society. The North had a very different view, which sometimes is called free labor. And under that view, the economy would be developed by persons who would start out at the lowest levels, and then say a paid laborer, then proceed to become working for a larger company, and ultimately developing their own business. So small farmers would develop into much larger farmers. So it was the nation was faced with the question: was the country going to become basically a slave society or a free labor society? This came to a head in the 1850s over the issue of the status of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which were the first area in which slavery was likely to develop west of the Mississippi. And under the Missouri Compromise, which had been entered into in the 1820s, this part of the Louisiana Purchase was supposed to be free states where slavery was not allowed. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 revoked the Missouri Compromise provision and left Kansas and Nebraska open to slavery, the issue to be decided later. It wasn't by the people settling there, and it wasn't clear what the process would be for settling this. This led to attempts by proponents of slavery to quickly move in, and opponents of free labor to quickly move in. There were violent disputes, and the issue was never settled. And then to make matters worse, the Supreme Court decided, the Dred Scott decision, among other things, that Congress had no power to decide whether a territory, pre-statehood, would be free or slave. So this was also a recipe for chaos, and fighting in Kansas and Nebraska continued right up to the date of the Civil War. Now, as a result of this growing national interest in what would be happening west of the Mississippi, some new parties were formed. And for the first time, national parties got into issues of slavery. The Whig Party collapsed because they couldn't reach a position on slavery, and new parties were formed, which they weren't abolitionist parties. They weren't urging an ending of slavery in states where it now existed, but they were opposed to the expansion of slavery into the West. And these parties included first the Free Soil Party, established in 1848 and ran a strong presidential campaign in 1852. Then they merged into the Republican Party, which was even stronger. And first candidate for president was John Fremont in 56, and Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. Now this, the rise of slavery as an issue in national politics presented a challenge for Douglas. Was he just going to continue as a Garrisonian, urging immediate abolition of slavery everywhere? Or was he going to support the new political party, which wasn't perfect from his standpoint, it wasn't for immediate abolition in the states where it was legal, but at the same time, it was opposing an expansion of slavery. And over the 1850s, Douglas agonized over what to do about this, and a lot of back and forth, but he ultimately ended up supporting the Republican candidate, and a lot of back and forth and grousing in between. Here are some of his statements in support of his pragmatic approach of supporting someone who didn't favor an immediate end to slavery in the South. In supporting Hale in 1852, Douglas wrote that the voter ought to see to it that his vote shall see the highest good possible. At the same time, it does no harm. In supporting Fremont, he urged his readers, take Republicans not merely for what they are, but for what we have good reason to believe they will become. Stop seeking purity and start with as possible. And in supporting Lincoln, he said he would much prefer a party which, unlike Lincoln's Republicans, favored an immediate end to slavery in the South, but in the absence of such a party, he would support parties that he preferred the Republicans to the Democrats that, in his words, stand for all that is slaveholding, malignant, and Negro hating. Although he was supporting this limited reform of slavery, he was supporting the party that only urged stopping expansion of slavery. Douglas continued to come out strongly for abolition in general. And one of the most famous speeches he made on this subject is called the 4th of July speech. And a Black Studies scholar, Henry Gates, has described this speech as the oratorical masterpiece of the abolitionist movement. It probably came as a surprise to the ladies group in Rochester, New York, which invited Douglas to participate in the 4th of July ceremony. They probably expected him just to give a speech saying how wonderful the 4th of July was and how wonderful American independence was. And he did start out that way, but then to their probable disappointment, he went on. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, Your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and your thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States. He went on in this speech to criticize the internal slave trade within the United States. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of this, but we'll make the slides available to OLLI members. Others, this is widely available on the internet, the 4th of July speech. Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers, armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men and women and children from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See too that girl of 13, weeping, yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. Excuse me. Turning to the other major issue of the 50s, which Douglas was involved, that's the Fugitive Slave Law. Under the Constitution, there's a provision that slaves who escape to states where slavery is outlawed will not become free by that status, and they shall be returned to their masters to continue as slaves. The Constitution says this in general, but it doesn't say who's going to capture them, who's going to send them back. And of course, you had slave catchers who would pursue fugitive slaves in the North. But the trend before 1850 was that it was getting harder and harder for enslavers to get their slaves back from the North. Some states passed what they call personal liberty laws, which sort of like what sometimes goes on with undocumented aliens today, where under these laws, the states would not cooperate in getting them returned. But in 1850, Congress passed a new law, which was tilted strongly to the enslavers. First of all, federal marshals were given the responsibility for capturing estate slaves, and states and private citizens were required to assist the federal efforts. If an alleged escaped slave was captured, they had no right to contest their status in a jury trial. And their status would be determined by federal commissioners. And the commissioner would get a higher payment for a case if the finding was that the captured person was a slave. So they get more money if they found it was a slave and should be returned than they would if they found that it was a free person who should not be returned. Douglas was very active in opposing this law, both by personal actions and by advocacies. He was a participant in the Underground Railroad. He lived in Rochester, New York, which was very close to Canada. So he made his house available to fleeing slaves who would, as they were able to, make their escape to Canada. In advocacy, he made some strong statements in supporting violent resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law. Here's the new law was, of course, strongly resisted in the North, and there were lots of demonstrations. There were sometimes mobs would storm the jails and take arrested fugitive slaves out, and there was some violence against the slave catchers. And Douglas was supportive of this violence, which was contrary to Garrison, who was a pacifist. Douglas once said that a slave catcher who captured a slave should be murdered in the streets. In a case in which a deputy US Marshal was killed while guarding a slave, Douglas defended the killing, saying that the Marshal had made himself the common enemy of mankind, and his slaughter was as innocent in the sight of God as would be the slaughter of a ravenous wolf in the act of throttling an infant. We hold that he had forfeited his right to live, and his death was necessary. Douglas had a controversial relationship with the leading violent abolitionist, John Brown. They had a friendship, collaboration of over 20 years where they met many times. Brown was engaged in a violent incident in Potawatomi, Kansas, where the fight was going on between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. In this dispute, John Brown, who was not from that area, and his sons went to Kansas and participated, and they murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. Douglas later defended this murder. He said, "The horrors wrought by his iron hand cannot be contemplated without a shudder, but it is the shudder which one feels at the execution of a murderer. Necessity is the full justification of it." As you know, Brown's ultimate plot was to capture the United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry and encourage slaves in the area to flock to Brown and his supporters, and ultimately to set up a freed slave republic in the mountains of what is now West Virginia. Brown made considerable efforts to get Douglas to join him in this raid on Harper's Ferry. Douglas decided not to do so. He was convinced that the strategy was a disaster, that if they took over a federal arsenal, the federal government would come down hard on them. And Douglas was also convinced that the slaves in Virginia would not revolt, which in fact they didn't. Douglas and Brown before this had considerable conversations, and they had discussed a draft constitution for the new slave republic. Brown, of course, the revolution was a failure, and Brown was captured and hung. Douglas was thought to be a co-conspirator in the raid, and Douglas was in Pennsylvania on a lecture tour at that time, and both the federal government and state governments were trying to apprehend him to arrest and try him as a co-conspirator. Douglas fled first to his home in Rochester, and then to Canada, and then he went to England. In 1860, he felt comfortable enough returning to the United States and campaigned for Abraham Lincoln. And Douglas had some incriminating papers of his exchanges with Brown, and as soon as Brown was caught, Douglas telegraphed to his son in Rochester to destroy the papers. So the election of Lincoln, of course, leads to the Civil War. Douglas was a supporter of the war, and his biggest concern was that the war would be ended with a compromise and negotiated settlement, which preserved slavery in the South, Douglass wanted the war to result in the end of slavery. And in his words, no war but an abolition war, no peace but an abolition peace, liberty for all, chains for none. The black man a soldier in war, a laborer in peace, a voter in the South as well as the North. America is permanent home, and all Americans his fellow countrymen. During the war, Douglass was involved in several issues. First, when would the whether and when the slaves would be freed. Secondly, when they were freed, would they be allowed to serve in the military forces of the United States? And after they were freed, would they become full-fledged citizens, or would they be encouraged to colonize and leave the country? So these were three issues with which he was involved during the war. For emancipation, Lincoln came to emancipation only gradually, and saw a number of conflicting issues that had to be resolved. There's no question that he always found slavery immoral and abhorred it, but he had other objectives in mind which prevented him from coming out for immediate emancipation after the war started. First of all, he gave a higher priority to saving the Union than to freeing slaves. And a famous quotation of his in a letter to Horace Greeley: "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." A secondary problem is that in the war, there were the Deep South states, which were committed, but then there were 4 slave states in the North, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky, which sided with the Union. And a lot of Lincoln's strategy during the war was to keep those states on board, and he feared that emancipation of their slaves would cause them to join the Confederacy. And another famous quote of Lincoln: "I must have God on my side. I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Lincoln was also a supporter of colonization of slaves leaving the country, and he held a meeting with Black leaders. Douglass was not included, and he urged the Black leaders to support voluntary colonization. And one of his remarks to them at the time were, "You and we are different races. We have between us a greater difference than exists between almost any other 2 races. We should be separated." The Blacks did not attending the meeting, took this under advisement, decided they would not support colonization. Douglass, who was not at the meeting, was outraged at this position of Lincoln's. As Douglass wrote in opposing colonization, "We are Americans by birth and education, and have a preference for American institutions as against those of any other country." And he also stated that Lincoln's seeming belief in white supremacy makes him a genuine representative of America's prejudice and Negro hatred. Lincoln eventually did issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the states that were with the Confederacy. And as a result of advocacy by Douglass and others, the Emancipation Proclamation did not include any mention of colonization. And it also announced that Blacks would be accepted into the military. And Douglass became very actively involved in recruiting Blacks for the military. The first Black organization was the Massachusetts 54th. This was an all-black regiment with white officers. It wasn't just from Massachusetts, it was soldiers all around the country. If you saw the 1989 movie Glory, that's about that regiment and their attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, in which 272 out of the 600 men in the regiment were killed, injured, or captured. Douglas, in recruiting for that regiment, signed onto a brochure called Men of Color, to Arms, Now or Never. And Douglas considered blacks serving in the military as the utmost importance in ultimately gaining them liberation and full citizenship. In his words, once a black man could get upon his person the brass letters US, an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States. Although blacks were allowed to serve in the military, they were placed in a lesser status than whites. They were paid less. A white private would get $13 a month. A black private would get $10, and then there would also he'd have to, of that 10, he'd have to pay $3 for his expenses. And Douglas didn't approve of this. Also, blacks couldn't be officers, which Douglas didn't approve of. The Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration, Stanton, tried to get Douglas to engage in further recruiting and promised him he could be an officer if he did this, but that never came to pass. To try and get equal treatment of the black soldiers, Douglas went to the White House without any appointment and sat in with the group of that congregated there every day. Groups would come to the White House every day looking for federal patronage jobs and a meeting with the president. Lincoln or his staff noticed that Douglas was there and immediately picked him out of the crowd to come into the meeting. And those of you who worked for politicians will know this is the way politicians treat people they want to get along with. As Douglas went into the meeting, he describes it, the president arose from his chair and the two shook hands. The president said, "Mr. Douglas, I know about you. I've read about you, and Secretary of State Stewart has told me about you." And leaving Douglas feeling at ease, Douglas made his pitch for equal pay. Lincoln felt he couldn't do that because there would be too much resentment among the white soldiers in the North, and there'd be pressure for him not to allow the blacks to serve at all. Douglas decided against enlisting in the black military. He took some heat for this since he had sent two of his children off to enlist. After the war, we of course have the major issues of what is going to be the status of the freed slaves. Will they be allowed to vote? Will they have the same legal rights and protections as whites? And what assistance will they get from the government? Douglas placed the greatest emphasis on getting the right to vote. And this he very much foreshadowing of Lyndon Johnson, who also felt that the most important things that could be done for blacks in the South was to get them the right to vote. And once they were allowed to vote and elect people to office, other rights would follow because there would be a political force and power in the government. Here's a description of a lecture tour that Douglas made supporting the right to vote in 1865. At every stop, Douglas preached the moral value and the practical meaning of the right to vote. He called the prospect of the vote his one idea, Everything else depended on the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the Black man. The vote had been earned in blood, in embodied citizenship, and it would be the freed people's protector against the treason and deadly hate of the defeated Confederates. In supporting the right to vote, Douglas made some arguments which seemed a little shocking to our current political views. He made arguments, he adopted the characteristics of different races and argued that blacks were more qualified than other races to vote. He claimed that blacks, comparing blacks to American Indians, he claimed that blacks had achieved the character of a civilized man, while the American Indian is too stiff to bend and regards your cities, your steamboats, your canals, and railways with aversion. He contrasted blacks with drunken Pat, fresh from the Emerald Isle, stepping up to the pole, leaning upon the arms of two of his friends, unable to stand. He said that blacks should have the access to the ballot box alongside the ignorant Dutchman. Now let's go somewhat chronologically through Douglas's participation in the status of freed slaves after the Civil War. Lincoln, of course, as the war was drawing to an end, was developing his own Reconstruction plans. His basic approach was that he would not require blacks to vote. He would leave that up to the states. He, of course, died before the war ended, so there was never any absolute decision on that. His concern with black voting, or promising black voting before the war was over, was that he was concerned that this would so outrage Southern whites that it would cause them to refuse to surrender, or they would surrender but keep up a guerrilla warfare, which actually is not far from what happened when the blacks were allowed to vote. There was sort of the equivalent of a guerrilla warfare to take it away from them. Lincoln appears to have softened somewhat towards the end of his life, and thought that blacks who had served in the military and possibly some very intelligent blacks should be allowed to vote. After Lincoln's death, the new, before I get to Andrew Johnson, here's just another good quote from Douglas supporting that all blacks should be allowed to vote. We invest with the elective franchise those who with bloody blades and bloody hands have sought the life of the nation, that's the Confederates, but refuse to invest those who have done what they could to save the nation's life. Lenient emancipation policies, which did not allow black voting, would hand him, that is the freed slave, back to the political power of his master without a single element of strength to shield himself from the vindictive spirit sure to be roused against the whole colored race. Successor Andrew Johnson was opposed to black voting. An infamous 1867 message to Congress, Johnson declared that black people had shown less capacity for government than any other people in the world, and when left to their own devices, they exhibited a tendency to revert into barbarism. Historian Eric Foner has concluded this is probably the most racist statement ever made in a public document by an American president. There was a historic meeting between black leaders led by Douglas with Johnson in the White House. The delegation told the president how important the right to vote was to them, and they were entitled to it. They fought for freedom. Johnson strongly disagreed, and he urged that colonization would be a much better solution than giving them the right to vote. This led to some heated exchanges between Johnson and Douglas and the other leaders. It's reported that in some exchanges, Johnson repeatedly cut Douglas off and asserted there would be a war of the races if blacks got on the ballot, and that racial equality should not be forced on a community without their consent. Douglas replied, that was said before the war. Johnson asserted that states' rights was a principle, a fundamental tenet in my creed that the people must be obeyed. This is what he's using as a justification for the people have to decide whether blacks should be allowed to vote. He asked Douglas, is there anything wrong or unfair in that? Douglas smiled and replied, a great deal wrong, Mr. President, with all respect. It's later reported in the press that Johnson was infuriated by the meeting with Douglas. It's reported that he said after the meeting, those damn sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damn Douglas. He's just like any other N-word, and he would sooner cut a white man's throat than not. Johnson's plans were rejected by the Congress, and in 1868, the radical Republicans adopted constitutional amendments giving blacks the right to vote and protection against discrimination and violence. Federal troops were sent to the South to protect black rights. The whites of the South, well, Douglas, of course, it's called Congressional Reconstruction. It didn't last very long. Beginning in about 1872, the whites and the former rulers of the South began a campaign of terrorism to prevent the blacks and their supporters from voting. They were successful in this, and we ended up with an all-white Democratic Party controlling the South. In the election of 1876, Douglas strongly urged the Republican Party to get involved and to restore the rights of blacks to vote. He argued to the Republicans, you have enfranchised us and I thank you for it. But what is your emancipation if the black man, after having been made free by the letter of the law, is unable to exercise that freedom, and after having been freed from the slaveholder's lash, is subject to the slaveholder's shotgun? The Republicans did not really go along with this, and nonetheless, Johnson supported the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, as the lesser evil. After the election, while the election was in dispute, Hayes made an agreement that he would, not only would he not do anything to advance black rights in the South, he would withdraw the federal troops, which had previously protected the blacks. After this, the Republican Party paid only, in future presidential elections, paid only lip service to gaining rights for blacks in the South. Douglas, nonetheless, ended up supporting the Republican candidates, particularly James Garfield and William Harrison. He did this on the theory that they were the lesser evil, and like other Republicans, he ran on what's called waving the bloody shirt, holding the South responsible, Democrats responsible for the Civil War. As a result of his support of Republican presidential candidates, he got some presidential appointments, which I'll discuss later. In supporting these candidates, Douglas came under criticism from a new generation of black leaders who retained the old militancy and didn't think the blacks should be tied into any political party, a leader in this was John Mercer Langston of Virginia, who was the first Black Virginia congressman and recently has become notable in the portions of Lee Highway in Arlington and Fairfax have been renamed as Langston Boulevard. Another critic of Douglas's loss of militancy was the dean of Howard Law School, Richard Greener, and a longtime abolitionist, Sojourner Truth. Here's some criticism of Douglas in an Elmira newspaper, claiming that he had settled down in his own age in a comfortable federal office, counseling his people to suffer and wait. This is not the tone of his olden speech. It is sad to see such a transformation. This was something of an exaggeration. As we'll see, Douglas continued to give strong speeches for Black rights, although it wasn't always reflected in his voting. He got on the wrong side of the Black militants and the positions he took in what was described as the Kansas Exodus. This was a movement that was started in the South to get the freed slaves to move to Kansas and to get the federal government to give them support there. President Hayes urged the Blacks to stay put and promised that in the long run the federal government would get improvements in their condition. Douglas sided with Rutherford B. Hayes, urged the Blacks to stay put and not go to Kansas and work hard and gain the equality they had been promised. As I said, Douglas says standing as a Black leader was also undermined by his acceptance of lucrative federal jobs. Another controversial position was many times in the 1880s called the self-made man. And in this speech, he was taking the position that the Blacks in the South would be largely responsible for whether they made it or didn't make it, and that it's no excuse that you had been a slave. To quote from that speech, "They, the self-made, are men who owe little or nothing to birth, relationship, friendly surroundings, to wealth inherited, or to early approved means of education. From these remarks, it will be evident that allowing only ordinary ability and opportunity, we may explain success mainly by one word, and that word is work, work, work. Everyone may avail himself of this marvelous power if he will. How will this general theory affect the Negro? And what shall be done in his case? My general answer is, give the Negro fair play and let him alone. If he lives, well. If he dies, equally well. If he cannot stand up, let him call down." And militants at the time, and interestingly, conservatives today are taking that as Douglas saying that it's totally up to the Blacks whether they succeed or fail, and the government shouldn't be doing much to help them. As David Blight points out, this is unfair to Douglas because he held that Blacks were responsible for their own condition if they were given fair play. And what did fair play mean? The nearest approach to justice to the Negro for the past is to do him justice in the present. Throw open to him the doors of his schools, the factories, the workshops, and of all mechanical industries. For his own welfare, give him a chance to do whatever he can do well. I mentioned that Douglas got some, also he revised his autobiography. This was the third version of it. And in the revision, he emphasized his success after the Civil War and explained how that had been carried out by hard work, and that he was an example of the self-made man. This was very much in the spirit of a leading character of the late 19th century, Horatio Alger, who by hard work made it up from poverty. Some of the important federal positions, Douglas Scott, he was named as Marshal of the District of Columbia. This was the first Black named to a position requiring Senate confirmation. The Marshal played a major role in bankruptcy proceedings, supervision of prisoners, escorting presidents and inaugurations. Garfield didn't allow him to continue as Marshal, but named him Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. And finally, President Harrison made him Minister to Haiti. This was at a time when the United States was in Haiti and the Caribbean generally trying to get sort of favored positions in the nations of the Caribbean, good trading relationships and military bases. This didn't work out well for Douglas. He had mixed feelings about leaning on the Haitians this way, and ultimately resigned. Finally, as I've said, although Douglas was less of a militant after the Civil War, he always made strong speeches in support of Black rights, and this is one made late in his life. And he became associated with Ida B. Wells, a Black leader of the 20th century, and Douglas engaged in a speech he gave many times, a strong criticism of lynching and the sharecropping system in the South. And I'll conclude with this. This is a speech he gave up to the end of his life in 1894. First on lynching. In its thirst for blood and its rage for vengeance, the mob has blindly, boldly, and defiantly supplanted sheriffs, constables, and the police. If the mob is in pursuit of Negroes accused of crime, jail doors are battered down in the presence of unresisting jailers, and the accused awaiting trial, shot, stabbed, or burned to death, as the blind and irresponsible mob may elect. With a few noble exceptions, the upper classes of the South are in full sympathy with the mob and its deeds. Press, platform, and pulpit are generally silent, or they openly apologize for the mob. The mobocratic murderers are not only permitted to go free, untried and unpunished, but are lauded and applauded as honorable men and good citizens. The guardians of Southern women. If lynch law is in any case condemned, it is only condemned in one breath and excused in another. And then in criticizing the sharecropping system in which Blacks were supposedly, well, they were entitled to farm their own land, but then they had to give the products to the landowner who was in charge of selling it and giving the Blacks a fair accounting of what it had been sold for and the profit sharing. And frequently Blacks were cheated under this system and reduced to a very impoverished living. And Douglas said, the landowners of the South want the labor of the enslaved on the hardest possible terms. They once had it for nothing. They now want it for next to nothing. With this power over the Negro, this possession of his labor, you may easily see why the South sometimes brags that it does not want slavery back. It had the Negro's labor heretofore for nothing, and now it has it for next to nothing. And at the same time is freed from the obligation to take care of the young and the aged, the sick and the decrepit. Well, this concludes my presentation on the. Oh, excuse me. I have to, I forgot. One more thing. Very recently, Douglas has been in the news because a very large statue of him was added to the visitor center of the Capitol, which was opened in 2013. It's a 7-foot tall statue, and the controversies of his life are somewhat continued because until this, every state has the right to have 2 statues in the Capitol, and until 2013, the District of Columbia, because it was not a state, only had the right to 1 statue, and they were allowed to have this second statue, and the installation of the statue led to a big debate over how unfair it was that the district was not a state. But anyway, this concludes my presentation. I see there's some, I don't know if the chat has questions, or I'll look at the Q&A first. We have about 10 minutes. When Douglas traveled on trains for speeches, were there white persons also with him? I think there frequently were. How much did it cost to purchase Douglas's freedom? It wasn't much. It was, I think, I'd have to quickly look that up. It's about maybe $700, and maybe be 40 or 50,000 today. Do you want to take a 5-minute break for cough? Thank you. I think I got beyond it. Self-made man is the exact opposite of Martin Luther King, not having to pick oneself up by the bootstraps. Okay? I don't know about the, forget about the naming of, his original name is Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I'll look into that. What was the role of Douglas's wife? Was she an activist? We could have a whole lecture, half a lecture on Douglas's relationship with women. She was not an activist. She was very much a stay-at-home person, and Douglas remained married to her and somewhat devoted to her, although he disappeared from home for many years and developed some friendships and working relationships, if possibly romantic relationships, with white women in Europe. I think Anna Douglas was basically not even able to read, and these other women were very intellectual types. But he was loyal to her, and they did raise a large family together. Many of his children turned out to be disappointments, and part of the reason he had to take these federal jobs was so he could support his family. Let's see. Was he able to be a large influence on Reconstruction actions that occurred after the Civil War? I would say, I mean, the pressure, as I said, the pressure he created for the right to vote was part of a lot of pressure that was very important, but not in the blow-by-blow. Let's see.
There are a few questions and comments in the chat if you'd like to see those, sir.
Okay. Let's see. Oh my, there's a lot here. Okay, I'm scrolling down. So far, it's just greetings from, I guess, probably AARP from all over the country, and very glad to have you here. Let's see. Maine, Pittsburgh, Hudson Valley, Salt Lake City, Erie, Hell's Kitchen. Okay, any suggestions, group tours and preferences for guides at Douglas's home in Southeast DC? I have to admit, I've never seen that. I thought it was something I'd very much like to do and should do. That was about a year and a half ago, but we were in the midst of COVID, and I've never felt comfortable going back there. I intend to go, and urge you all to. For those of you who don't know, Douglas, after his house burned down in Rochester, moved to the district and had a very large house in Nicosia, and that's now a National Park Service site. Huh. Now here's something I wasn't aware of. DC area, there'll be a new musical at Arena Stage. Frederick Douglass, American prophet Frederick Douglass in his own words. Well, I'll certainly look forward to that. May even have to risk COVID to see that.
As far as the recording, the OLLI YouTube page does have this available, and I'm sure we can coordinate with AARP for access to that. In fact, I don't think there's any limitation on viewing from the OLLI YouTube site. So most any AARP could search for OLLI at GMU and find that YouTube page with a number of recordings available.
Let me see this. Let me get the. There's a couple of more popped up in the Q&A. Okay, comments rather than questions. But, okay, well, if there's nothing else, thank you all for the compliments and the. Oh, okay, here's another one. Did his sons take up his effort? I'd say, as I said, I think his sons largely not, and some of them didn't have very admirable lives. But okay, well, thank you very much for your interest and attention, and for the kind words of the chat. For OLLI members, I don't know if this, I don't think AARP makes longer OLLI courses available, but in case they do, next fall I'm planning a more general course on slavery and Reconstruction in America, which will get into more detail about the Republicans and Lincoln and the whole broad picture. But again,
there is a hand raised by
I think
Reverend Barbara Johnson Cox. See if she can unmute. Afraid, yeah, she's not getting to the unmute. All right, that being the case, sir, I'll go ahead and close at this point. And thank you very much for your time.
thank you, Mike, for your help.